Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in to the Adam Smith Institute's third webinar. We've been so thrilled with the success of the series, and we're really looking forward to all the future installments, so be sure to sign up to our emails, make sure you're not missing anything. We'll be discussing the future of migration this week with Katie Andrews, Christian Niemitz, and Xenia Chopra. Before the vast parts of the world began to shut down, the UK was in a really unique position to rewrite our approach to immigration. Brexit provides exciting opportunities or immense challenges, depending on who you ask. But we have this opportunity to decide the future of our migration policy. How do we create an immigration system that fulfills the economic and social needs of the UK? Will we need restrictions on lower skilled immigrants? Will priority be given to Commonwealth countries, or will there be a points-based system or a lottery? We still need to answer these questions, even with coronavirus disrupting our daily lives. But we also must acknowledge that we are in the midst of a crisis that has led to the shutting of borders across the world. When this is all over, will migrants find it even harder, or will immigrant doctors and nurses in the NHS show the importance of foreigners to our lives? More immediately, will countries like the US and the UK be able to source temporary labor that drives the agricultural sector and keeps the country fed? We'll be talking about all of that and more this evening. Before I start with the chair discussion, I'd just like to introduce all of our speakers. First, we have Xenia Chopra, who is head of client services within the immigration team at Kingsley Napley Law Firm. She has over 10 years experience working in business-to-business relations and advising, and she previously managed Access Tier 5, a Tier 5 government authorized visa exchange scheme. She has had 6 years and more working with the Tier 5 GAE visa route and is one of the country's few leading experts on the scheme. Next, we have Kate Andrews, who is the economics correspondent at The Spectator. She previously served as the Associate Director of the Institute of Economic Affairs and as the Head of Communications at the Adam Smith Institute. She is well known for her work in various newspapers, including City AM and The Telegraph. She also regularly appears on flagship political programs across all channels. And last but not least is Dr. Christian Niemitz. Christian is the Head of Political Economy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. He joined the IEA in 2008 as Poverty Research Fellow before rising through the ranks and becoming Head of Political Economy in 2018. He writes on a number of different topics, and his 2019 report on immigration policy, Picking the Low-Hanging Fruits, was widely covered in the media. I'd like to kick off with some opening statements, and then we'll move on to a chair discussion, starting with good old immigration policy reform, before we move on to a bit of COVID-19 related discussion. We'll finish off with Q&A at the end, so be sure to submit your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom, or you can comment on Facebook if you're watching via Facebook Live. Let us start with some opening statements. Christian, would you like to go first? Let me just.
Yes, thank you, Morgan. First of all, it is a bit strange, of course, to join a panel on cross-border movement at a time when most of us can barely leave our house. I would not be surprised if this year we reached the net migration target for, I think this would be the first time. So we now have pretty much the system that groups like Migration Watch were arguing for the whole time, meaning that we're all stuck where we are and nobody can move around anymore. It's just that, well, it's horrible and miserable, but we might reach the target anyway. Nonetheless, if things go back to normal by the beginning of next year, then we are going to get a completely new immigration system. And it makes sense to have a look at that already. It contains a couple of good bits. For a start, the upper limit on the number of visas for skilled non-Europeans is going to be dropped. So at the moment, there is an absolute cap on the number of visas that are given to skilled migrants from outside of the European Economic Area. That's set at just over 20,000 people. That is going to be abolished, that cap. So skilled migrants from outside of the EEA can come in principle, limitless numbers. And the salary threshold is also going to be cut. At the moment, skilled non-Europeans who come through that route have to earn at least £30,000 a year, more in some sectors. That's going to be cut to just over 25,000. This doesn't sound like a revolutionary change, but it is quite a big change simply because a lot of people earn in that range between the old threshold and the new one. The median salary falls between these two thresholds, so that's going to make a big difference. And finally, the skills threshold is also going to be cut. At the moment, non-Europeans have to have at least an undergraduate degree or some equivalent of that, university, tertiary education, and that is going to be cut to lower secondary education. That will count as qualified already. So that amounts to substantial liberalization of migration rules for non-Europeans. So far, so good. There are a couple of bad things in the new system as well. Above all, well, not above all, one of the bad things is there is not going to be a regular route for self-employed people. I can see why they do it from an administrative perspective, because that will be quite hard to monitor. Anyone can come and say, oh, I've got a great business idea, let me in. It would be hard to supervise that in practice. But nonetheless, there are some groups of migrants who have fairly high self-employment rates. Eastern Europeans in particular, about 1 in 5 of them or so, are self-employed. And it's a bit ironic that you close down that route, because one of the common complaints has always been that immigrants compete with natives for jobs. Now, if you close down the self-employment route, then by definition, that becomes the case. That becomes, to the extent that it is an issue, it becomes a bigger issue, simply by design, by policy design. And the worst aspect of the new system is, and this goes back to one of my favorite lost causes, which is defending free movement within Europe. That's going to come to an end. That's not exactly news, we knew that, but it is now definitive. And I continue to think that that is a big mistake. Now, to be clear here, I'm not a complete open borders libertarian. So I'm not arguing from a perspective of absolute ideological purity here. I accept that when you have lots of people from very different cultures all living in the same place, that is going to cause tensions and disruptions. I have no trouble acknowledging that, but I really cannot see a good case for having migration controls between culturally similar countries. So I would not just keep free movement within Europe, I would extend that to other culturally similar countries. Certainly that would include Australia, New Zealand, and North America, and potentially others. I don't have very strong views on who exactly you include here or how exactly you define that, but that should be the basic idea, that you have that freedom of movement would be the default option for culturally similar countries, and that you have a liberalized and greatly simplified version of a visa tier system for the rest of the world. That would be my kind of ideal, and unfortunately we're not getting very close to that.
I think now we will go to Xenia, if you're ready, Xenia.
Yeah. Thank you, Morgan. I think I'd like to echo Christian's sentiments in the sense that it doesn't definitely seem the right time to talk about immigration, given we're all locked up due to this COVID-19 crisis and all the travel bans in place. But I do want to discuss what our current immigration looks like and what it's going to look like. I think Christian very kindly highlighted some of the positive points coming up in the new immigration system as of January 1, 2021. But I want to talk in a little bit more detail about that. So talking about the current immigration system at the moment, for the year ending 2019, there were about 3.2 million UK visas that were issued last year. This is a 10% increase from 2018. There was an 11% increase in the Tier 2 general visas. For those who don't know, Tier 2 is an employer-sponsored visa. There was a 50% increase in the number of people who were granted visas under the exceptional talent visa route, now renamed and rebranded as the global talent visa. And I feel like these trends will continue to increase, the numbers will, and the percentages will increase in the coming years, especially because of this more liberal, more open immigration system that's going to be launched 1st January 2021. I'm not going to go into too much details about this new immigration system because Christian has already covered that, but just to give you a brief overview, some of the most important changes will be the resident labor market test, the abolition of the resident labor market test. Those who don't know at the moment, if you're not hiring offering an international student who's studying in the UK, if you're offering a job to someone who with a salary of lower than £159,600, or if the job is on a shortage occupation list, then you do need to advertise that role for at least 28 days or across 2 platforms. So employers will be really happy to hear this, that come January 2021, the resident labor market test is being abolished and the employers will no longer need to advertise this role. So they don't need to prove it to the UKVI why they're offering a job to a let's say a non-EU person or from anywhere in the world really, rather than Bob from down the road or its UK settled worker. So that's a very good change. The other one, of course, Christian mentioned about the 20,700 annual cap on the tier 2 general visas. I don't know how many of you remember this, but 2018, there was a massive chaos and the migrants were not able to apply for the visas under tier 2 if their salary didn't meet the certain threshold, which was around 46,000. And it turned out that at that point in time, it was the nurses and the doctors who were meeting the salary thresholds and were within this cap. And that's why the rest of the migrants who didn't earn high enough, they weren't meeting the criteria. And this cap kept hitting again and again, and it happened for numerous months. I work in the immigration business in an immigration law firm. You can imagine the clients going absolutely panicking around this. But then, of course, they took out the nurses and the doctors out of that cap, and in 2019, that cap wasn't hit. So again, it's a very good change that this 20,700 cap is being removed, and there's not going to be any restriction in terms of the number of people that will be coming onto the UK on a tier 2 general visa. Salary thresholds being reduced. Again, the fresh entrant salary at the moment sits as 20,800. That is someone who's under the age of 26 or an international student in the UK. This salary level will be dropped to 17,920. And an experienced worker, someone who's above the age of 26 or has a lot of experience, their salary at the moment, the way it sits, is it's on 30,000, and this will be dropped to 25,600. Very good news for employers, especially employers that are based outside of London, because not everyone's able to pay the London wages, and dropping the salary threshold would definitely benefit those businesses and those employers. And the last one, of course, the RQF level, the Regulated Qualifications Framework, which currently sits at RQF level 6, which means a degree level role. Now, at the moment, if you want to sponsor an individual who's coming to the UK on a tier 2 visa, they need to be offered a degree level role. And there are lots of roles that are not degree level role, or they may be A-level roles. So as of 1st January 2021, this threshold is being brought down to RQF level 3, which means those roles that don't currently fit within the RQF level 6 category will also be eligible. So I guess the pool of migrants will be a lot wider, and a lot more migrants will be able to apply for this tier 2 visa. And finally, another post-study work or the graduate visa route is coming back. I'm a big champion of the graduate visa or the post-study work because in 2006, I came to England as an international student from India, and I took advantage of that post-study worker visa route, and it really helped me land on my feet, get to the place that I am now, and I'm a huge supporter of this post-study worker visa route. So we don't know how it's going to work at this point in time. The government hasn't released enough details about this post-study worker visa, but if it's going to look anything like what the old PSW, it would work really, really well because it's not doesn't tie down a student or a graduate to an employer or to a role. The students will be allowed to seek employment freely with any employer. They wouldn't be tied down to salaries or anything like that. So again, that's some big positive changes coming in. There are a few negatives, of course, of this immigration system as well. I think employers who already employ a lot of EU staff, they will have to apply for sponsorship licenses. And I have to tell you that this is not an easy process. It's cumbersome, it's paper intensive, requires a lot of attention to detail, and it's also expensive. So imagine employers who have never had to navigate the immigration system, and because they've solely relied on EU workers, now they have to apply for the sponsor license, understand the compliance obligations that they have in place. On top of that, pay the fees to sponsor this EU national who, up until now, they didn't need to do that. So there'll be significant costs in terms of training, in terms of understanding compliance, and also paying UKVI fees. I would suggest the Home Office, I don't think they're going to take the suggestion into consideration, but my suggestion definitely would be for the Home Office to create a more tiered pricing strategy in terms of offering sponsorship licenses. At the moment, each business has to pay £536 to apply for a sponsorship license. So imagine how many businesses need to go ahead and apply for these sponsorship licenses. So maybe there should be some sort of tiered pricing structure. The other disadvantage or a con of the new immigration system would be that there is no low-skilled visa route that exists. The government, when the immigration white paper was published in December last year, they did say that they were going to introduce a temporary low-skilled worker visa route, which would allow nationals of certain countries to come into the UK for a period of one year, and then after the 1 year, a cooling off period would be set in place so they can't come back in for another 12 months. But recently, just last week, they published a further guidance and they said they will no longer be opening that up, which is saddening to me because with this COVID-19 crisis, who are our essential key workers? Who are the people who are looking after the economy at the moment? These are these low-skilled workers. So I think there definitely needs to be some sort of system in place that looks after these essential workers and low-skilled workers. I definitely appreciate the steps that the government is taking in terms of the resident labor market test, the abolishing the cap, the salary threshold, but I think I will leave it with this, that the government definitely needs to think about these low-skilled workers as well.
Thank you, Xenia. We will go to Kate now for some quick opening statements, and then I'll start the shared Q&A.
Great. I've unmuted myself. Hi. Thanks for having me, Adam Smith Institute. It's always wonderful to be back, even if we're not actually in its wonderful office and we're all at home self-isolating. I'll come on to why I think this is a very relevant conversation for the time that we're in a moment, but I just wanted to start by saying, I think in order to assess the new current immigration system that's supposed to come in on January 1st next year, you have to look at where we've been. And we spent the better part of a decade with a Home Secretary and then Prime Minister who was very hostile to immigration. All of the measures that were brought in made it much more difficult for both low-skilled and high-skilled workers to come to the UK and to settle here. Getting rid of the postgraduate visa was an excellent example and one that I have personal experience with. You took all the people you've just educated at top universities who are future taxpayers, and rather than giving them 2 years to find a job without any access to public benefits, you kicked them out of the country. And so there was just policy after policy, and then we saw the never achieved, thank goodness, but attempt to achieve the tens of thousands cap on migrants coming to the UK. And it didn't come from an economic perspective, but it didn't really come from an ethical perspective either, because all the focus was on numbers and it wasn't on the actual people coming here, taking up jobs, often doing work that native Brits don't want to do, contributing, being taxpayers and making a life for themselves. So when I look at the new reforms in that context, it's easy to dream of an immigration system from scratch. And I'm sure it would be much more liberal for all three panelists here than what we have. But I do see those benefits. It is going to be much easier for graduates and skilled migrants from all over the world to come to the UK to work. I'd highlight that we've always had a points-based system in the UK. It's just only applied to some. So if you were a non-EU national, you have been applying for your visa under a points-based system. There are actual points that are dished out for a series of things. But the key is that it's always been linked to employment. You, on almost every circumstance, have to have had a job in order to apply for that visa, but it is a points-based system. So rather than saying we now have one, actually, it's just been expanded. Now, as somebody who was a big fan of free movement, I appreciate that that's still a painful reality, but it isn't completely new to many people who didn't have the ability to simply come to the UK and work because of where they were from in Europe. It's also not like Australia's system, because still in the UK, it's going to be employment centric, meaning it's going to be very, very difficult to tally up those points if you don't have a job. I think even possibly impossible. So you're gonna have to have a job. And I agree with the panel that the real real problem with it is that there's no pathway for low-skilled workers. And I think that's why it's so relevant that we're actually talking about this from self-isolation in our homes, because basically overnight, the definition of low-skilled has now turned into the definition of a key worker. There was concern about nurses' pay not meeting the threshold, but I mean, we're talking about people who work in care homes, we're talking about people who stock the shelves in our local grocery stores. These are people who are key workers, who are risking their safety and their health to make sure that we can still have access to the vital foods and medicines and access to healthcare that we need in order to get through this pandemic. Now, the immigration bill, I believe, was supposed to go to its second reading. Don't quote me on that, this month. It was supposed to be quite soon. And it was supposed to go through Parliament without any questions asked. It's thought to be a popular policy with the public, thought to be popular politicians, but it's not through yet. If you ask me to put money on it, I think there's a good chance it still goes through, but I wouldn't be surprised if this were up for debate again, because what we have seen is that people who are willing to come stack shelves and people who are willing to take care of the elderly provide vital services to this economy. And when we look at the industries most badly hit by COVID-19 so far, we're looking at retail, we're looking at tourism, we're looking at manufacturing, and we're looking at construction. And these are industries in which many of those businesses, the vast majority really, often rely on low-skilled workers. They're taking the biggest hit now. To tell them that when they try to turn their business back around, when they come out of this economic hibernation, and when they have to go back into the world, they can't have access to the workers they need. I'm not convinced, especially with the leadership that we now have in cabinet, people like Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, who historically are fairly warm to migrants as far as the Conservative Party goes. I don't think they're going to be completely deaf when it comes to those concerns of businesses and the concerns of workers. So overall, I was relatively pleased with some of the changes that were made back early in the year. I think the changes that we've all been through now, which are very different and unexpected, only highlight the flaws in the immigration system. I would hope that they would be reconsidered. It's not to say that there shouldn't be some hurdle or some contribution that has to be made from low-skilled workers when they come here. But right now, the bar is set far, far, far too high. Xenia also mentioned fees. It's not just the salary that you have to have, it's the fees on top of it. Having paid them several times in my life, they are extortionate. They're extremely difficult to pay. You may well have a job lined up where you can come here and work and contribute, but you might not have the money in the bank to pay those fees immediately. So looking at that system, looking how to roll back some of that bureaucracy, looking at how to make it more accessible will be really important when we come out on the other side of this pandemic. It was certainly important before, but I think it's even more important now. Thanks, Morgan.
Great, thank you, Kate. I'm going to bring everyone back in, and I'm going to do a bit of a chaired Q&A, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience. So first, I want to do a quick one-line answer from each of our panelists. What do you imagine to be the most and least politically palatable immigration reform? Should we start with Christian?
I guess the most palatable one, or the easiest one, would be a free movement zone that includes Canada, New Zealand, Australia. I know there are some organizations lobbying for that, and there's surveys on that. That would be very popular. On the more controversial side, I don't know, it's never been asked in that way, but giving asylum seekers and refugees the right to work here from day one. I guess it would be controversial in the sense that it would increase the pull factor a bit, but it would help massively with integration and with public finances. So maybe that would not be such an unpopular idea.
Those are both policies advocated for by the ASI, so it appears we're both
then
politically
they can't be too popular
and unpopular. But I have to agree with you. I think that a Kansas style system has been shown to be very popular with the public. And you're right, offering migrants the ability to work upon entering would be very beneficial, if not necessarily popular on the face of it. Kate?
I think the most popular one has thankfully already been brought in, which is relaxing measures for students. And we have seen the the postgraduate visa brought back. I actually think, Christian, I think that giving refugees who apply formally and through the right processes, the right to work on day one, could be quite popular. I suppose another one I might throw in terms of being popular is, rather than having a cap on the number of years that a tier 2 migrant can stay, tier 2 is the highest tier for somebody working in the UK, as long as they remain in employment, could probably be quite popular, because the implication there is that as long as you're paying your taxes and you're paying your way, you can stay. In terms of more difficult things, I mean, opening up that pathway to low-skilled migrants, acknowledging that even some of them might not be net contributors from the very beginning, could be difficult. Of course, if you were to pair that with limiting access to benefits, I think that could be something that could sell. I don't really know if this fits in with immigration. It is technically a different topic, but I'm just going to say it anyway because I'm passionate about it. Granting amnesty to illegal migrants who are currently in the UK and giving them a pathway to citizenship is so overdue, especially in moments like COVID, where these people are completely off the books. They don't have access to resources, but may have been here for a decade or longer, have created an entire life and family. It's just tragic. So unpopular, but it's the right thing to do.
Senior, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the most palatable, I've got 2 points over here I'd like to talk about. This is personal to me because I would love for the government to bring back the retired persons of independent means visa back. And I tell you why. So it's just me and my mother. I lost my brother and my father a few years ago, and my mother lives in India. I live in the UK. She comes and visits me every year on a tourist visa and stays in the UK for maybe anything between 2 to 6 months, and because that's the longest time she can spend. Given that I don't have any other family, I would love for my mum to be able to come and live with me permanently and stay here, but I can't do that because, of course, there's no route to bring. Even if I apply for a British passport, which I haven't, I'm on indefinite leave to remain. I wouldn't be, even if I get the passport, I still will not be able to get my mum to move here to the UK indefinitely. This was a visa, the retired persons independent visa of independent means visa was a visa which allowed retired people to come to the UK as long as they could prove that they had £25,000 in their account and they could maintain themselves without being a burden on the NHS or without relying on the public funds. They would be allowed to stay in the UK and they could spend 5 years on this visa in the UK, and after 5 years they could apply for indefinite leave to remain. So I personally am a huge champion of this because, and for selfish reasons, of course, I would like for this visa reform to be brought back. The other one I would talk about is the innovative visa, which just doesn't work at the moment. If you look at the statistics, last year there were only 44 innovative visas that were issued. Innovative visa, just to give you a background, was a reformed version of the entrepreneur visa which existed in the past, and the government, they had concerns around the entrepreneur visa, and they said it was very easy and easy to take advantage of the entrepreneur visa, and anyone who had access to some funds could come in and set a business. Fine, I get that. But the innovative visa would basically shut down for business. We're saying no to all entrepreneurs because it's incredibly difficult. It's very restrictive. It's very onerous. It's, again, you need to apply to an overarching body or an endorsing body. The endorsing bodies, when the government announced about this innovative visa last year, they didn't have enough time to prepare. They didn't know what to do, who to endorse. So in the end, there was only 44 applications for entrepreneurs wanting to come to the UK and set up businesses. Recent research by the Entrepreneurs Network, it suggested that 49% of British fastest growing startups have immigrant co-founders. So while shutting our doors to 49% of these people, right, I think the innovative visa definitely needs to be reformed and make it less restrictive, less onerous, compared to in the first 6 months of when the innovative visa was brought in, there were only 14 visa applications that were offered the visa, compared to 997 applications in the year prior, comparing it over the same period. So it's just like, you just can't compare. I understand, like I said, where the government is coming from, and they wanted to reform the entrepreneur visa, But what we've done with the innovator visa, it just doesn't work. The endorsing bodies are dropping out like flies. They're not allowed to charge for their endorsement. So what they do is they're either a part of an accelerator or a VC. They expect the entrepreneur, the migrant entrepreneur, to maybe give them a percentage of their business, which not all entrepreneurs will want to do, you know. And because they're not allowed to charge for it as well, I guess what else are they supposed to do? A lot of these endorsing bodies are only endorsing businesses that are more tech-based. But what about entrepreneurs who are not tech-based entrepreneurs? Are we saying that we only want businesses that are tech-based? So I can go on and on about this, but yeah, I think the innovator visa definitely needs a massive reform.
You were answering a few questions I was going to pose to you in your opening statements as well. I was going to ask what you think businesses, what we could do to help businesses sponsor foreigners, but it seems like you've mostly answered that in your opening statement. So I think I might ask Christian. Christian, do you think there's a specific country that has their immigration policy right? And do you think that that model would work in the UK? We'll keep it kind of short if that's possible.
Yeah, well, my default answer to the question, which country is best at X, is always Switzerland. Whatever X is, Switzerland is probably the best in the world at it. I don't know if that default answer works particularly well in this case. I don't know that much about alternative immigration systems, but what you can say about the Swiss approach is that they have at least a couple of domestic policies that enable them to manage large influxes of migration certainly better than Britain. For starters, they have a very decentralized tax system. That means that if one town experiences a large influx of migrants and another town doesn't, then the first town will also experience a big increase in tax revenue, which the low migration town will not. And this, to some extent, ameliorates this point about, the public services can't cope. And I know people on the liberal pro-migration side and always make the argument that most immigrant groups are net contributors. Okay, technically true, but firstly, that's a somewhat more abstract argument. And then net contributor doesn't actually mean that the taxes that you pay really go into funding the services that you are using. There's no guarantee for that. In a more decentralized system, that you get a better match between demand for public services by migrants and the supply and the tax money that can go towards those services paying for them. There's also the issue that they have a much more liberal land use planning system. The housing supply can respond more quickly and more easily than here. That makes it much easier to cope with high levels of migration. And they have an insurance-based healthcare system, which is why this misconception that people come here using the healthcare service couldn't arise, because there it's much clearer. Yes, of course, migrants demand healthcare. They are consumers of healthcare services, but revenue for health insurers also goes up at the same time, and those health insurers can then simply use that extra revenue to fund extra healthcare. It's in principle the same thing here. It doesn't really matter whether it's insurance or tax in that sense. It's just more visible and easier to understand that the same people who demand extra healthcare also pay for extra healthcare. And it's those things that if we had those policies here, it would be easier to manage migration, and there would be less bitterness around it and fewer misunderstandings.
Oh, Morgan, you're muted.
I'm muted. We're working on this. Kate, do you have anything to add to that, or would you like another question?
Well, I agree that Switzerland is excellent. I would also probably be quite selfish and greedy and cherry pick stuff from around the world. The US is by no means the most liberal country when it comes to immigration, but they do have an interesting lottery system, which means that if you just couldn't get in based on certain points-based systems in the US, in the UK now, in Australia, that there's still a chance to get in. So I think I'd probably cherry pick a bit, but Christian said it well.
Okay. I'd also like to ask you, do you think we could get away from the kind of dichotomy of low skill, high skill? Like you said earlier, these low skilled workers are the people that are now keeping our economy running. But there's so much gray area there. I'm wondering what the panelists think about this kind of discourse around low skill, high skill, and what it actually negatively impacts the discussion that we're having. And do we think that there's any sort of middle ground, a better way to explain it, a better way to categorize it? I'd be interested to hear thoughts.
I think we have to be really honest about what people are concerned about. I agree with Christian's comments earlier that a lot of people don't want to admit to cultural concerns, but they may be coming from that place. But also people are very concerned about the tax base, and that's understandable. They worry that somebody could come over and abuse the system, and they've been paying in their whole lives, and they could be living payslip to payslip, and somebody comes in from a different country and just starts using those services. Now, unfortunately, on select occasions, that does happen, but especially with free movement from the European Union, that benefit system was quite generous to those who came over and weren't necessarily here for a long period of time. And I guess one of the benefits of taking back control of your immigration system is you can decide to what extent people get access to public benefits and when. And I think one of the ways to tackle concerns around low-skilled immigration is to make very clear that your access to benefits is limited. People are asked to pay an upfront surcharge to the National Health Service that is on top of any tax that they pay, which obviously part of that goes to funding healthcare. So there's no question when you come here from previously outside the EU that you've contributed to the NHS. I think making it clear to people that those who want to come here because their opportunities are better here, they want to work their way up the ladder here, moving from a classified low-skilled job, hopefully one day into a high-skilled job, are doing so because they want to make a better life for themselves, not because they want to take from you or your family. So I think getting the balance right between immigration and access to benefits is really crucial, specifically when you're talking about low-skilled workers. The other thing I'd say, and again, maybe COVID-19 has highlighted that, there are a lot of people, very middle class people sitting at home working. Yeah, life isn't great. It's a real shame that we're only supposed to go outside to exercise once a day. Some people are feeling a bit cooped up. No doubt that some of those struggles are real. But then there are other people doing jobs they don't want to do to make sure that they have access to food, to make sure that the shelves are stocked and the rest of it. And that's the key, right? There are jobs that a lot of native Brits don't want to do. And they're often low skilled. And connecting that in people's minds, it isn't so simple as to say, oh, well, if the low skilled workers leave, there'll be a job for me. It just may not be a job that you would put yourself forward to do, even if the salary were higher, which is one of the arguments about limiting the labor force, so salaries have to go up. Even in those situations, it doesn't mean that you actually want that job. So I think forcing those 2 points, reiterating them, helps with the discussion.
Yeah. And kind of taking that last point about the jobs that could be there, but you might still not want to do it. We might be facing a real problem with COVID-19 that we won't be able to get temporary foreign labor to do the jobs like picking fruit, picking vegetables, keeping food supply going. What do we think the solution to this is going to have to be? If we honestly cannot allow temporary workers from other countries into the UK during this crisis, are we going to have to turn to the resident labor market? I mean, we do have a lot more unemployed people because of COVID-19, but again, can you force people to go pick in the fields? I don't know. So,
and do you want to? Do you want to force them? I mean, probably not. Let people do the jobs that they want to do.
Does anyone have any thoughts on that? How are we going to fill these gaps that we normally get from temporary foreign labor?
I think there's also an argument. I know Professor Alan Manning from the Migration Advisory Committee has always reiterated that, let's build up the salaries, let's offer apprenticeship programs, and that's, and let's train our own people. But looking at these sectors, these low-skilled sectors, they can't really afford to pay those high-wage salaries within those sectors. And that's where the argument is. And I think Kate put it quite brilliantly, that there has to be a sort of a general understanding between it's these low-skilled workers who are our key workers at this point in time, and they're the ones who are supporting the economy. And that's why we need to come up with policies to support these low-skilled workers and temporary workers, because unfortunately, settled workers are not willing to do those jobs. They're not willing to undertake those salaries that are offered in those roles. And we don't have enough students who are studying those subjects or even want to go and undertake these apprenticeship programs.
Christian?
Yeah, I guess they are going to react to shortages in some sectors by simply creating more and more loopholes. So this has already happened with healthcare, that healthcare-related jobs have been added to the shortage occupation list. And you will probably get something like that in agriculture as well. And that's okay as a stopgap solution. The only problem I have with that is that then it comes down to well, essentially lobbying and visibility. And the problem here is that in those sectors, it's relatively easy to observe a shortage because at least in the short term, you just need a certain number of people in agriculture. Otherwise, you can't do the harvest. In many other sectors of the economy, it isn't so obvious. If you just have a lot fewer people working in gastronomy, in pubs and restaurants, it's not that you are going to see an obvious shortage in the sense that there will be that there will be papers in every window of every pub saying, we're hiring, please apply, please come to us, we're desperate. It's just that in the medium term, there will be fewer pubs, there will be fewer restaurants, but there will be no obvious measure of a shortage. So those sorts of occupations will never go on the shortage list. It's all a fairly arbitrary definition. I'd rather have an arbitrary stopgap solution than no solution, but apart from completely open or completely closed borders, there is just no non-arbitrary, no objective way to define a shortage.
Right. Well, we have about 15 minutes left, so I think I'm going to move on to a bit of audience Q&A. I think I'll start with one that we got that was sent in advance. There's actually two questions, but they both relate. It was about an Australian-style migration system working well for the UK. Is there any way in which a points-based immigration system can lead to a problem of overskilled immigration, such as reported in places like Australia, where we end up with overqualified immigrants taking lower paying jobs? Do you see that as being a legitimate risk?
I'd like to say, if I may, the government closed the Tier 1 general visa route and the post-study worker visa route in 2012 because of some of these concerns. And, they thought that we were ending with too many overqualified immigrants. But yes, it is true to some extent, but not completely. And let me explain that. It's because when these migrants, when they come to the UK, it's because they want to make a better living for themselves. So they might have had a higher education than a similar person who's a UK national or an EU national, and they're undertaking an unskilled job because they know it's a temporary measure. It's for the time being, it's a temporary solution while they're building up their confidence, or while they're experiencing the culture in the UK, or while they're learning the language and becoming proficient in the language itself. And I find that many of these highly, skilled migrants, as soon as they've overcome this, and understood the culture and the language, and they become minimally fluent, they will start to climb the ladder. There will be enough progression in their career. They will get promoted, or they might even open up their own businesses. And if they can't find a job where they don't get promoted, they'll go somewhere else. So I don't think that if someone is a highly skilled, if there's going to be too many highly skilled migrants, that is a problem necessarily.
Okay. Should we move on to the next question? We had one in about an auction-based system. So prices are generally a much better way of allocating goods than quotas or points. What are your views on a potential auction-based system of tradable permits, which would allow businesses to sponsor workers rather than the government?
Well, I would say, to be honest, it's not an auction system because obviously the government is still heavily involved in approving, but the UK really does have an employer-led system. So if you get a job in the UK, the government has intentionally structured the system so it is led by that job offer. So I think sort of a quirkier, maybe perhaps more fun question would be, what if you had a system in which you could trade essentially rights to live in a country with other countries? This is something that would take a heck of a lot of structure as well. I'm not saying it could be done overnight, but given the fact that it already kind of is the case that we're employer-led, I think the question is, how can somebody come here who doesn't necessarily have a job offer, who wants to live here and is willing to be self-sufficient in that way? So even though I guess a lot of the language around a points-based system has been confusing, because the government kept calling it an Australian points-based system, because Australia's kind of become known for having a system which is a bit liberal in some ways, but really strict in others. And so it kind of played with their base. That's not what we have. It's still very much employer-led. It's a points-based system that already existed in the UK that's now being applied to EU nationals. So if we really want to think outside the box, let's start thinking about ways to get those who aren't employed away into the UK as opposed to those who already are.
I have a question here. So this is from Inez. It says, will the lower skill requirements for non-EU workers, presumably making it easier for lower skilled non-EU workers to come to the UK, increase their potential social mobility, allowing for a greater quality of life? Maybe is this an egalitarian move where we're seeing the UK is kind of opening their borders to larger regions and maybe helping people in those countries who want to come to the UK again for a better life, lift themselves up, maybe send back reparations? Are we creating a more equal society by opening our borders to different countries and not prioritizing certain regions? Christian, maybe?
Yeah, I suppose it does, but I don't think that should be the policy objective. I don't think it should be about decreasing the global Gini coefficient or whatever. But yeah, it will have that effect. That but any immigration system does that. It's about it does offer people the chance to improve themselves, and it's always people on the liberal side of the spectrum have always tried to emphasize the overall economic benefits of that, and I'm not sure that's the right focus, because the Migration Advisory Committee in their reports, when they look at this, always show, yes, it's true, on the whole, immigrants pay their way, but the impact just isn't that huge on GDP per capita. It doesn't really matter that much either way. Of course, if we completely close the borders, then we would also experience a decrease in GDP per capita. But on the whole, it just doesn't matter that much either way. Most of the benefit goes to the immigrant, and I think that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to frame it always as something that the country relies on, or that it would be a hellhole without it. It wouldn't. You can, just like with other types of restrictions, you can live with tariffs, with less free trade. You make yourself a bit poorer, but it's just that if somebody wants to live here, as long as they play by the rules, pay their way, don't harm anyone, what's wrong with that?
Okay, yeah.
It doesn't have to have huge impacts on GDP, is what I'm saying.
As well, I think there's this false choice often created that it either has to be EU nationals or the rest of the world, and it's one that I've never really bought. Whilst I understood that a lot of the arguments made around the vote to leave the European Union were that migrants outside of the EU were treated unfairly, or treated in a harsher way. Again, I am one of them. I understand that the hurdles for me were significantly higher than they were for those coming from the EU, but it was never the case that you had to undo freedom of movement from any kind of policy perspective to make it easier for non-EU migrants to come here. So when it comes to fairness, we could have leveled the playing field, and I'm not saying this is politically feasible or even necessarily right, but you could have leveled the playing field by having universal free movement. You don't have to do it by raising the bar for everyone. And that's why I go back to my original point. I don't think this is the system we would have created if we were making one from scratch. Certainly not those of us who are very liberal on immigration and see its benefits. But if you do try to put everyone in the same system, finding that balance can be quite difficult. But I do get frustrated when people say that it's the EU or it's the rest of the world. It doesn't have to be that way.
Do you think that's a false dichotomy created by the Brexit argument? The fact that, the vote to leave may have reflected a want to restrict free movement, but we practically probably still do need free movement to get those certain migrants, and we need to fill the gaps that we don't even realize that we have. I mean,
It may turn out that we don't need free movement, but we probably need a much more liberal immigration system than the one that they came up with at the beginning of the year, and that pathway for low-skilled migrants. Now, that's not me commenting specifically on whether free movement is good or bad. It's just saying you probably can achieve it without free movement, but this system is going to make that more difficult, which is why I'm interested to see if it will be reassessed. I do think Brexit was a big part of framing it in that way, but it's not the fault of the Leave campaign or Brexit voters by any means. This is a conversation that's been brewing for decades, really, and it came to a head in 2016.
Sure. I'd like to move on to universities. We're getting a few questions about universities. One person asked, how is this going to affect the application process? There was a question from Max. Universities are heavily reliant on immigration from Europe and provides a large boost to the economy. Do we need to incentivize immigration to our universities, kind of trying to keep foreign students? Questions on, let's just start there. Bit of a university thing. We have the great change with allowing students to stay after they've finished studying, but what's the longer term picture? Are we trying to get more foreign students into the university system? What do you guys think? It's a bit of an aside into higher education, but I think it's really heavily related. I came here as a student, so did Kate, so did Xenia, and I think Christian, did you come here as a student as well?
Not originally, but I then became a student again, part-time.
Right. So we're all experienced with the university system as immigrants. Do we think that this is an integral way to get people into the UK?
I think, like I said earlier, bringing back the post-study worker visa route is definitely a step in the right direction for international students, because many of us international students who come here to the UK, we come here to make experience the wonderful life of working in the UK, and we do want to gather that ever so valuable UK work experience itself. So giving that opportunity to international students is definitely a step in the right direction. Coming back to numbers, when the post-study worker visa route was taken away back in 2012, the international students numbers fell drastically. And one of the countries that affected the nationals of that country was India, where there was a significant drop in the number of international students from India. Having said that, in 2019, in just last year, there was a 19% increase on 2018 in terms of the number of student visas that were granted itself, of which Chinese nationals were the #1 nationality who were granted a Tier 4 student visa, making a total of 42% in total. And Indian nationality, as I said, after the closure of the post-study worker visa route, the numbers of Indian nationals dropped down significantly, but this number has also gone up as of last year itself. So it went up almost 93% to 37,540 Indian nationals, to be precise, as compared to 2018. So we've definitely seen an increase in the number of Indian and Chinese nationals applying for Tier 4 student visas. And with this post-study worker visa coming back in, I think these nationalities and other nationalities as well who are interested in gathering this work experience in the UK, we will definitely see a surge in the number of student visa applications.
Any thoughts on that, or should we turn to closing statements in our last 5 minutes? Okay, does anybody have any closing thoughts? I thought it was interesting that we are all migrants here in this panel, so we actually all dealt with this firsthand. Like Kate said, it is not easy to be a migrant in the UK, and I think people who do come to the UK to make a better life really are doing it because they love this country. I don't think people necessarily just pick the UK at the drop of the hat. There's a question from, I believe it was from Eamon, my boss. He said, why do people want to come to the UK? What is it about the UK that people are willing to, spend all this time, money, and effort, in some cases even risk their lives to come here? Maybe we're getting a bit existential and nostalgic, but I just thought it was interesting that all four of us have chosen to make this place our home.
I'm happy to start. That sounds like Eamon. Sounds like an Eamon question. Yeah, I think the big takeaway from me is that this government did signal at the beginning of the year that it's going to be different on immigration than the previous ones did. And that this idea that migrants should go home, putting that on the side of vans, that was hopefully coming to an end. Trying to balance that with the, very obvious outcome of the 2016 referendum, and the fact that immigration did play a large part in it, certainly wasn't the whole reason, but did play a large part, has been a difficult one. And I think a lot of the changes, if they were to come in January, would be positive. I think 3 of the 4 of us here, I'm not sure about Xenia, will have really struggled, I mean, just constantly, daily sometimes, to make sure that we can stay here. And we've done so because this is our home and we want to contribute to it. And it's, you know, for almost every single migrant you meet, that's going to be the reason. It's going to be something really positive. So I'm pleased to see that that's changing. And perhaps, I don't think there are going to be too many silver linings to COVID-19. But perhaps if there is one, it is that this new value has been put on those who were left out in the immigration reforms in January. And I really hope we can include them in the months ahead.
Christian, any closing statements?
Nothing
okay,
specific.
Christian likes immigration.
Yeah.
Some of it.
Read Christian's report, picking the low-hanging fruits, if you would like to know more. Xenia, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think Kate summarized it beautifully. And like I said earlier, all the changes that the government has announced are definitely a step in the right direction. They were definitely required. We do need to take into consideration low-skilled workers and some sort of reform or some sort of system put in place to keep low-skilled workers migration in the UK, because as we've seen with the COVID-19 situation, with the crisis, they are the key essential workers who are supporting and keeping us all, you know, providing us food and delivering food from Ocado, and, you know, working in Tesco's and Waitresses where we're getting all our food, and looking after the elderly in the care homes. So, well, I think the takeaway from this panel for sure has to be that we should probably lobby the government and ask them to create a system to be put in place for the low-skilled workers.
Great. Well, with that, I'm going to thank everyone for coming. Thank you to our panelists for a lovely discussion. Thank you for everyone who joined us. I'd like to quickly plug our webinar for next week, which is going to be hosted by my colleague, John McDonald, who is the head of government affairs. It's called Post-Pandemic Priorities, Rebooting the Economy, and he'll be joined by Daniel Hanan, former MEP and president of the Initiative for Free Trade, and Johnny Levensley, who's the chairman of the Midlands Industrial Council, and Dr. Eamon Butler, who is co-founder and director of the Adam Smith Institute. So that will be same place, same time, 6 p.m. BST next week. Thank you again, Kate, Xenia, and Christian, and I hope you all have a lovely evening.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.